No one would have guessed it by looking at her. Clara moved with quiet grace, spoke in soft tones, and never made a scene, not even when her world shattered. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife. Elegant, devoted, dependable. And in many ways, she had been all of those things, until the night she opened his laptop. It wasn't suspicion that drove her. It was routine. He had asked her to send over a work file, something he'd forgotten in his rush to leave for a business trip. But when she opened the folder, a second one caught her eye, titled with a woman's initials. Curious, she clicked. In that instant, Clara's life fractured into two distinct timelines. The one she had lived and the one that had been happening behind her back. Photos, emails, flight confirmations, even love letters. Her husband, Victor, wasn't just having an affair. He was building a second life, with someone younger, louder, reckless. Clara didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't even cry. She simply closed the laptop, stood up, and poured herself a glass of water. Because betrayal, when it hits that deep, doesn't explode. It sinks. As the silence wrapped itself around her chest, a new voice awakened inside her. Not one of rage, not even heartbreak, but calculation. She knew she had a choice. Explode, now and lose control, or wait. Watch, understand. She chose the second. Because Clara had learned something long ago. The most dangerous people are the ones who appear the calmest. They don't react, they prepare. And so, she smiled. Not for show, not for forgiveness, but because she had just found her purpose. From that night on, Victor would live under the illusion that he had gotten away with it. He would sleep beside her, laugh with her, make plans for the future. All while she watched, measured, and planned the moment when truth would no longer be avoidable, because she didn't want revenge in the form of drama. She wanted something colder, something permanent, something he'd never see coming until it was already too late. The days that followed felt like walking through a theater where everyone else was acting, but Clara alone knew the real script. She moved through each moment with precision, preparing breakfast, answering texts, attending dinner parties with Victor on her arm, never once letting the fracture beneath her smile show. If he noticed anything, it was only how understanding she had become. He mistook her silence for softness, her calm for forgiveness. But Clara was documenting everything. Not just the digital traces, but his movements, his patterns, the names he mentioned, and the ones he avoided. Every lie he told became a thread she carefully unwound in the quiet of their home office, late at night, when he believed she was asleep. She backed up his emails, took screenshots, saved copies of receipts. Each click was a step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward control. She began gathering not just proof of infidelity, but of financial deceit. Clara discovered secret transfers, hidden accounts, a second phone bill tied to an unknown number. The betrayal wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. And suddenly, she realized she wasn't married to a man who made a mistake. She was living beside someone who never saw her as an equal, only as a convenience. That realization didn't break her. It clarified her. And from that clarity, a quiet power emerged. She started making changes, small at first, updating legal documents, speaking to a discreet attorney she trusted. She didn't tell anyone, not her friends, not her sister, not even her mother, because the strength of her plan depended on silence. If Victor ever sensed her knowledge, he would twist it, charm his way out, manipulate. And Clara was done being gaslit. She wasn't preparing a dramatic confrontation. She was crafting an exit so calculated that when she left, there'd be nothing for him to hold on to. No money, no assets, not even his reputation. She didn't want him hurt. She wanted him undone, piece by piece. She smiled more often now, ironically, because every time she looked him in the eye, she knew something he didn't. This wasn't her revenge. This was her rebirth. And he was still too arrogant to notice. On the outside, everything looked perfect, perhaps even better than before. Clara and Victor were suddenly the couple everyone envied again. He posted photos of them at weekend getaways, dinners under candlelight, public displays of affection designed for an audience. Friends commented with hearts and goals. But Clara knew every photo was a disguise. He wasn't showing the world their love. He was hiding his guilt. And Clara? She smiled beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder while her mind operated like a chessboard. Already 5 moves ahead. Behind the curtains, she was building something. Not a plan for revenge, but a future where he didn't exist. She began consulting a private investigator, not to catch him in the act, but to fill the gaps she couldn't reach alone. The investigator worked quietly, confirming everything Clara already suspected, and more. Multiple hotel reservations, an apartment under someone else's name, a registered company tied to Victor with a woman listed as co-founder. It wasn't an affair. It was a parallel life. The more she uncovered, the less she felt grief. Something colder had taken root. She no longer mourned the man she had married because she now understood. That man never existed. He had been a story she believed in, a mask worn perfectly, patiently, until it no longer served him. But Clara was not a victim. Not anymore. She moved her assets without alerting him, removed herself quietly from business contracts they once shared, changed passwords, built a firewall around everything she owned. She even changed the beneficiaries on her life insurance. Every document signed was another brick in the wall that would soon rise between them. Impenetrable, permanent. Victor continued his charade, unaware that the woman who once adored him was now quietly erasing him from her world. And Clara? She still kissed him goodnight, still packed his bag before a trip, still said, "I love you," because the truth wasn't ready to be spoken yet. Timing was everything, and she didn't want justice in the form of chaos. She wanted him to feel safe, certain, and in control, right up until the moment he realized he had already lost everything. That moment, she promised herself, would be perfect. The moment finally began on a Tuesday. Not with a storm, not with yelling, but with a breakfast table set like any other morning. Clara placed the coffee mug in front of Victor, just as she always did. Toasted bread, 2 eggs, over medium, the way he liked. She sat across from him, sipping her tea, while the clock ticked in the background like a metronome of patience. He scrolled his phone, half listening to her small talk, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was already gone. She had chosen this morning deliberately. Everything was ready. The lawyer had filed the documents. The accounts were secured. The apartment had already been vacated the day before. Her name was no longer tied to anything he could claim. She had even closed the joint credit cards quietly days prior. He hadn't noticed. Of course not. Victor never looked beyond his reflection. When he stood up to grab his briefcase, Clara stopped him with one sentence. "You should check your email before you leave." He turned, eyebrow raised. "Why?" "Just do it," she said calmly. No anger, no tremor in her voice, just a strange, steady finality. He unlocked his phone and tapped the screen. And then, he stopped breathing for a second. Clara watched the confusion spread across his face like spilled ink. The email was from her lawyer, with attachments, financial statements, a letter of intent, divorce proceedings, full documentation, everything, laid out like a final meal. Victor blinked. "What is this?" She stood slowly. "It's the truth you thought I didn't know, and the consequences you never thought would come." His voice cracked. "You're overreacting." "No," she interrupted. "I waited. I watched. I gave you the silence you mistook for weakness, but I was building my escape while you built your lies." For the first time since it all began, Clara saw him shaken. Really shaken. Not because she was leaving, but because she had taken control without him noticing. That was the revenge. Not screaming, not destroying, but leaving without begging. Leaving in power. Leaving with everything he thought she would never find. Proof, timing, and herself. And now he was left with nothing but the realization that she had never stopped watching. Victor's reaction wasn't immediate fury. It was denial, thin and frantic. He started pacing, mumbling excuses, weaving broken explanations like someone trying to patch a sinking boat with paper. "It didn't mean anything," he said. "You and we were just in a rough patch." Clara remained still, unmoved. She didn't speak to argue. She wasn't there for negotiation. Her silence now had a different weight. It wasn't the silence of submission, but of decision. She watched him unravel. The man who had always held the upper hand was finally cornered, not by confrontation, but by preparation. "We can fix this," he said, grasping. "Let's just talk." "I did talk," Clara replied, her voice calm but piercing. "You just never listened." Those words cut deeper than any scream. Victor sank into a chair, as if only now realizing that this wasn't a scene. It was a conclusion. He looked up, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Clara gave a faint smile, not of amusement but of sad clarity. "Because I wanted to know who you really were when you thought I didn't know. And now I do." That was the real wound. She hadn't acted out of rage, but out of strategy. She hadn't lost control. She had mastered it. And in that mastery, Victor saw the truth. This wasn't a woman pushed too far. This was a woman who had already walked away in every way but physically. Clara handed him an envelope, neatly labeled. Inside were the keys to the car he would keep, the apartment lease termination, a printed bank statement showing the frozen accounts. "There's nothing left to discuss," she said. "Everything is in motion. You can fight it if you want, but you won't win. Not because I'm cruel, but because you were careless." Victor didn't move. His mouth opened, but no words came out. She had disarmed him not with violence, but with silence wrapped in truth. And as she turned to leave, Clara didn't feel victorious. She felt clean, like stepping out of a house that had been burning for years, finally free of the smoke she had learned to live with. And for the first time, she didn't look back. Clara didn't go to her sister's house. She didn't call a friend or check into a hotel. Instead, she drove for hours until the city lights gave way to silence. She found a small coastal town she had once visited as a teenager, a place untouched by time, where the ocean didn't judge and the air didn't carry anyone's name. She rented a modest cottage with white shutters and uneven floorboards, where the only noise was the wind. That night, she unpacked a single suitcase, sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, and listened to the waves. The world had changed, but she hadn't fallen apart. In fact, for the first time in years, she felt whole. There were no eyes on her, no need to perform, no need to be the perfect wife, the forgiving woman, the polite hostess. She was just Clara. And in that space, stripped of all the roles and expectations, she could finally ask herself the question that had waited too long. Who am I without him? The answer didn't come in words. It came in breaths, in the way she no longer flinched at silence, in the steady beat of her own presence. She didn't check the news or social media. She knew the fallout would come. Victor would likely spin a story, paint himself as the abandoned one, the victim of a sudden, heartless departure. But Clara didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth didn't live in headlines. It lived in her decisions, in the documents filed, in the eyes of the lawyer who had called her brave, and in the quiet dignity of every moment she hadn't exploded. Revenge hadn't been the goal. The goal was liberation. And that she had achieved. As the sky began to fade into dawn, Clara whispered something to herself. Not a vow, not a promise, just a truth she had carried for too long without saying aloud. I deserved more. She repeated it once, slowly, letting it settle into her skin, not with anger, but with peace. And in that fragile moment, something inside her bloomed, not loudly, but undeniably, because some women don't rise by being loud. They rise by being unshakable. Back in the city, Victor's world was beginning to collapse. At first he believed Clara would return, that this was a scare tactic, a cry for attention. He tried calling, messaging, even sending flowers. But the silence that came back was more deafening than any insult he'd ever received. Then came the legal summons. Formal, unmistakable. His lawyer told him the truth he hadn't wanted to hear. Clara had not only secured her share of the assets, she had protected herself at every level. There were no loopholes to exploit, no public scandal to twist in his favor. She had left no traces of weakness, only a trail of facts. Even the joint business they once ran together had been restructured months earlier, quietly, thoroughly, and completely in her favor. She had removed herself from every liability, while leaving him exposed. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a dismantling. And now people began to notice. Clients pulled away, friends stopped calling. Rumors circulated, some whispered with pity, others with amusement. She planned it all. He never saw it coming. Maybe he deserved it. Victor hated those voices more than he hated Clara's silence, because those voices didn't just question his character, they mocked his illusion of control. In private, he began to unravel. He drank more, slept less, stared at old photos, trying to find signs he'd missed. In one of them, taken just weeks before the collapse, Clara stood beside him, smiling gently. He looked at that smile for hours, searching for cracks, for hints of her plan. But there were none, and that haunted him more than anything. Because she had looked at him, knowing everything, and still smiled. That smile wasn't fake. It was final. He began to understand. Clara hadn't just left him. She had defeated him, not through anger, not through destruction, but through design. He had betrayed her trust, and she had answered not with rage, but with strategy. And now she was gone. Not hiding, not lost, just unreachable. Victor wasn't mourning a marriage. He was mourning the loss of the person who had always known how to love him better than he deserved, and had chosen, finally, to stop. While Victor unraveled in a city full of noise, Clara was waking up to a kind of quiet she had never known. In the seaside town, the mornings weren't rushed. There were no alarms, no forced smiles, no calendars packed with obligations she didn't choose. She walked barefoot along the sand, her hair undone, her hands free. People in town knew her, only as Clara, no last name, no history attached. And for once, she liked it that way. She wasn't someone's wife. She wasn't someone's secret keeper. She was just herself. And for the first time, that was enough. She started writing again. Nothing fancy, just thoughts in a notebook she carried everywhere. Some days she wrote about the betrayal, not to relive it, but to remove its power. Other days, she wrote letters she'd never send, to her past self, to the girl who forgave too much, to the woman who stayed too long. And one day, she wrote to Victor, not in anger, but in closure. You mistook my love for permission, but love is not silence, it is presence, and I had disappeared long before I walked away. She folded the page and placed it under a stone, near the sea, letting the tide decide its fate. Clara didn't want revenge anymore. What she had now was better, clarity. She no longer replayed the nights she cried in silence. She no longer tried to understand how he could lie so easily. Some answers don't come with explanations. Some people aren't puzzles to solve, they're storms to survive. And she had survived. She even started to laugh again. Not politely, fully, loudly. The kind of laughter that takes over your body and shakes loose all the grief that once lived in your ribs. It startled her at first. She had forgotten what it felt like. She began to cook for herself, decorate her space, plant small things, basil, lavender, tomatoes. She tended to them daily. Because healing isn't just about moving on. It's about choosing to nurture again, to create, to care, without fear of betrayal lurking beneath the surface. Clara wasn't rebuilding what she lost. She was building something new, and this time it belonged only to her. One afternoon, as Clara sipped coffee at a small cafe near the edge of the water, a woman approached her. She looked hesitant, as if choosing between curiosity and respect. "I'm sorry," she said gently, "but are you Clara Martins?" For a moment, Clara almost said no. Not out of shame, but because she no longer recognized that version of herself. But instead, she smiled politely. "I used to be." The woman sat nearby, introduced herself as a former client of the business Clara once co-managed with Victor. "Everyone's talking," she admitted. "But honestly, I admire what you did." Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The woman continued, "You didn't destroy him. You just stepped away. And somehow that did more. That stayed with Clara. Not because it validated her choice, but because it confirmed something she had come to believe. Sometimes, the most powerful response isn't revenge. It's refusal. Refusal to play the game. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to disappear. That night, Clara walked along the shore alone, her feet sinking into the cold sand. The sky was painted in deep purples and fading golds. She thought of everything she had carried: grief, anger, betrayal, doubt, and how much of it had already washed away. Not completely. Some wounds stay, but they no longer bled. They no longer dictated her steps. She realized then that what Victor had broken was real, but what she had built after was sacred, not flawless, but honest. And honest was enough. She stood at the edge of the water and whispered a quiet thank you. Not to him, but to herself, for not collapsing, for not staying where love had turned into manipulation, for being brave in silence and strong without witnesses. She turned back toward the cottage, barefoot and wind-kissed, and didn't feel alone. Not anymore, because sometimes peace doesn't come with apologies or closure from the person who hurt you. Sometimes peace comes when you finally stop needing either. She didn't check her phone. She didn't wonder what Victor was doing. His story was no longer hers to carry. Her life had turned a page, and for once she wasn't afraid of what the next chapter might bring, because this time she was writing it. Weeks later, Clara returned to the city, not to reclaim her past, but to settle what remained of it. She walked through the streets not as the woman everyone whispered about, but as someone who no longer owed anyone an explanation. The buildings looked smaller now, the faces less intimidating. Even the memories that once weighed down every corner seemed faded, as if they belonged to another life. She had scheduled a final meeting with her lawyer, not for strategy, but for closure. The divorce was finalized, the accounts separated, the silence had served its purpose, and now she was ready to speak. Not out of anger, but from clarity. Her lawyer, a composed woman with sharp eyes and a gentle tone, handed her the final papers. "It's done," she said. Clara read every line slowly, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she wanted to absorb what this moment meant. The end of a marriage is rarely about the signatures. It's about the space that opens afterward. The terrifying, beautiful space where a new version of yourself might grow. When she stepped outside the office, a breeze caught her scarf and lifted it just slightly, like the air itself was lighter. She stood on the sidewalk for a few moments, letting the city move around her. Taxis honked. People rushed past. Life pulsed forward. But she didn't move. Not yet. She was no longer running from something. She wasn't chasing anything either. She was just still. And that stillness, once foreign, now felt like home. Her phone buzzed. A message from an old friend. Lunch sometime? Clara smiled. Not because she would say yes, but because she had the freedom to choose. For so long, her days were dictated by someone else's priorities. Now, even the smallest choice, when to eat, where to go, who to see, was hers. That, she realized, was the quiet revolution of starting over. It didn't roar, it whispered. It moved slowly like healing, and yet it transformed everything. Clara didn't need to prove herself anymore, not to Victor, not to the world. She had already done the hardest thing anyone can do: walk away with grace from a life that once defined her, and decide to define herself instead. Clara didn't rush into a new life. She let it unfold, piece by piece. She started working part-time at a local cultural center, helping organize writing workshops for women. At first, she kept her story to herself, but slowly, as the sessions grew more intimate, she began sharing bits of it. Not the scandalous parts, not the betrayal, but the essence. The feeling of being unseen for too long. The ache of being erased while still breathing. And every time she spoke, a room full of strangers nodded. Not because they knew her past, but because they recognized something in themselves. Pain, after all, has many faces, but silence is often its loudest. Clara didn't speak to impress. She spoke to connect, and in that connection, she found something she hadn't expected. Community. Not the shallow kind built on appearances, but the honest kind, born from vulnerability. Other women began confiding in her about neglect, betrayal, fear, and the terrifying courage it takes to start again. Clara listened without judgment. She didn't give advice, she gave space. Because sometimes all someone needs is proof that healing is possible. That strength can be quiet. That survival isn't always dramatic. It's in the small, invisible decisions made daily. She began writing a series of essays. Not under her name, at least not yet. She used a pseudonym. Not to hide, but to protect the sacredness of the story while it was still forming. Her words weren't polished. They were raw, honest, and sometimes fractured. But readers connected to that imperfection because it mirrored their own. One day, after a workshop, a young woman approached her and said, "Your story gave me permission to stop apologizing for leaving." Clara smiled. Not out of pride, but gratitude. Because that's what she had always needed too. Not someone to fix her, but someone to remind her she was allowed to choose herself. Every time she wrote, every time she listened, every time she stood in that room surrounded by stories too, often ignored, Clara became more herself. She wasn't rebuilding who she had been. She was discovering who she could be without fear. And the more she embraced that truth, the less power the past held. Because when a woman reclaims her voice, she doesn't just heal, she teaches others how to begin. One evening, long after the workshops had ended and the city had fallen quiet, Clara sat alone in her apartment. This time, not with sadness, but with stillness that felt earned. The walls no longer echoed memories. They held her present. The shelves had books she had chosen. The paintings were hers. Even the scent of the room, lavender and wood, belonged to a space where she wasn't performing, only existing. She poured herself a glass of wine, opened her notebook, and read the first page she had written months ago. "I'm not sure who I am without him, but I think I'm about to find out." She smiled gently, not because the sentence was wrong, but because it had led her here. Healing hadn't been loud. It hadn't been glamorous. It was daily, quiet, sometimes boring, sometimes painful. but always honest. And now, it felt like she had shed layers that weren't hers. Expectations, performances, silence. She lit a candle, not to set a mood, but to mark the moment. A ritual she had started just for herself, one flame, each time she realized she no longer needed permission to be at peace. That night, she wrote a final letter. Not to Victor, not to the past, but to the woman she used to be. She wrote of the patience it took to wait, the strength required, to walk away without burning everything, the grace of letting truth do its quiet work. She ended the letter with one line. You didn't fail by loving him. You succeeded the moment you loved yourself enough to leave. She folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box she kept near the window. Not to forget, but to remember. Because healing doesn't mean erasing. It means integrating. Honoring the path that brought you home. As the city lights flickered in the distance and the wind tapped gently against the glass, Clara exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but from arrival. She had stepped into her own life, not as someone defined by betrayal, but by her response to it. And in that space, she felt something return. Something soft, something whole. Not hope, not love, but herself. And that was enough. Months later, Clara found herself standing in front of the very building where her old life had ended. It wasn't planned. She had been walking home from a bookstore when she turned a corner, and suddenly, there it was. Victor's former office. Tower, tall and sterile, with mirrored windows that once reflected the version of her he had wanted the world to see. She paused, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. Would the weight return? Would the air shift? But to her surprise, it didn't. There was no sting, no echo, just stillness. She stepped forward, not into the building, but to the sidewalk, across the street. From that safe distance, she watched people coming and going, businessmen, assistants, interns with coffee cups and clipped conversations. And she wondered how many of them were living someone else's story, wearing masks, like she once did, smiling through betrayals no one else could see. She didn't pity them. She understood them, and understanding, she had learned, was far more powerful than resentment. She pulled out her phone, not to call anyone, but to open her notes. She began typing a new piece, one that didn't begin with pain, but with a question. What do you do when the life you built wasn't made for you? The words flowed easily, like they had been waiting. She wrote standing there, on the edge of a memory that no longer owned her. And when she finished, she looked up, took one final breath of that old world, and turned away. She didn't need to be near it to feel strong. She had become strong by surviving it, and stronger still by walking forward. A few blocks away, she bought herself flowers. Not for any occasion, just because they were beautiful. And as she carried them home, people smiled at her, not because they knew her story, but because something in her energy had changed. She wasn't haunted anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was a woman who had learned the art of letting go, the science of staying quiet, and the courage it takes to wait for the perfect moment to reclaim your name. And she had done it, without noise, without cruelty, just clarity. Clara placed the flowers in a simple glass vase and watched the water ripple as each stem settled into place. They weren't extravagant, just white lilies and soft eucalyptus, the kind of bouquet that didn't beg for attention, but brought beauty to a room without asking permission, much like the woman she had become. That evening, she prepared dinner, alone, playing her favorite music low in the background, humming along without thinking. She didn't feel lonely. She felt full of breath, of space, of ownership over her own time. She no longer measured her days by someone else's schedule, no longer waited for permission to rest, to dream, to exist. After she ate, she sat by the window with her journal open and began writing a letter. Not a personal one this time, but a public piece. one she would submit under her real name. The fear was still there, a faint tremble in her fingers. But courage, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing it anyway. The essay told a story not about revenge, but about rediscovery. About the silent strength of waiting for the right moment, not to strike back, but to step forward. She titled it, "The Day I Stopped Disappearing." When she finished the final sentence, she read it aloud in the soft light of her living room. Her voice didn't crack. It was steady, measured, and as the words filled the air, she realized something vital. This was never about Victor. It was never about what he took. It was about what she reclaimed, her time, her voice, her presence. Clara submitted the piece that night. No fear, no delay. And afterward, she lit her candle, poured a second glass of wine, and whispered the same words she had once written in secret. I deserved more. Only now, it wasn't a hope. It was a truth fully lived. She glanced around the room and saw herself everywhere. In the paintings she had chosen, in the books stacked messily on the shelf, in the mirror that reflected someone whole. She had become her own home. No betrayal could undo that. No past could define it. Clara had waited for the perfect moment. And when it came, she didn't destroy. She redefined. Weeks later, the essay was published. It didn't go viral. There were no headlines, no dramatic reactions. But slowly, quietly, messages began to arrive. Some were just a single line. Thank you for writing what I couldn't say. Others came from strangers who had never left a relationship, but who now, after reading Clara's words, were considering something radical, choosing themselves. She read every message, not with ego, but with reverence, because she knew what it cost to speak when you've been silent for too long. One afternoon, she printed out her own essay and folded it carefully, placing it beside the very first page. She had written in her journal months before. She tied both pages together with a red ribbon and tucked them inside a wooden box she kept at the back of her bookshelf. Not to forget, but to honor. Later that evening, she returned to the ocean. One last time. The tide was low, the sky pale with dusk. She carried nothing with her but herself. No memories to bury, no ghosts to release. She didn't come to say goodbye. She came because she could. She sat on the sand and watched the waves return and retreat, like breath, like time. She thought of the version of herself who had waited through the lies, the silence, the ache of pretending everything was fine. That woman hadn't been weak. She had been brave enough to wait for the right moment to begin again. And when that moment came, she didn't just walk away. She stepped fully into herself. Clara stood, brushed the sand from her dress, and whispered one final truth into the wind. Not for anyone else, but for her own soul to hear. I am no longer the secret. I am the story. Then she turned and walked back, not toward a man, not toward a memory, but toward her life, one she had rebuilt, in silence, in strength, and on her own terms. Because some women don't break loudly. They break free, softly, strategically, beautifully. And when they do, the world doesn't always notice, but they do. And that's enough. Clara didn't need to be remembered by others. She just needed to remember herself.